Deep within the sanctuary's borders, nestled between the twisted roots of ancient trees, a peculiar peace had settled. The air was thick with the smell of earth and the faint, wild sweetness of blossoms. The forest, dense and tangled, had been untouched for years, silent, save for the whispers of the wind and the flutter of leaves in the eternal dance between shadow and light. Here, the forest's pulse was slow, its rhythm dictated by the ebb and flow of time in nature's hands. There was something both ancient and restless about this place, a world where the ordinary met the extraordinary. No humans had ventured here for decades. The sanctuary was a place left to the creatures of the wild, a haven shielded from the intrusions of modern life. Even the trees seemed to tower with a sense of purpose, their gnarled branches reaching skyward in silent defiance of time. Birds called to one another from the canopy, their voices an eerie, haunting chorus. But this silence, this peace, was not to last. One late summer evening, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift began to stir the air. It started with the smallest rustle, the faintest tremor in the earth beneath paws and hooves. A single, delicate butterfly flitted through the dense underbrush, its wings brushing against a vine of soft purple flowers. These flowers, though beautiful, were far from ordinary. They were the butterfly bush. For years, the bush had grown in silence, flourishing unnoticed, its seeds carried by the wind into new territories. But something had changed. The bush had grown wildly, spreading across the forest floor like an unstoppable force, its tendrils weaving into the roots of trees, claiming more and more of the sanctuary as its own. The animals, for the first time in many years, began to feel the weight of the change. A group of deer, usually graceful and calm, moved uneasily through the woods. Their senses were heightened, their movements jerky and hesitant as they passed the spreading bushes. The once peaceful clearing where they grazed was now overrun, the once familiar scent of wild grasses replaced by the pungent fragrance of the blooms. It wasn't just the deer who felt the change. Birds had become scarce. The rustling leaves now seemed more like whispers of something unknown, ominous warning that drifted through the trees. The once familiar sounds of the forest had shifted into an unsettling silence, broken only by the occasional distant cry of a hawk. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. And then came the night. The full moon rose high in the sky, casting its silver light over the forest. Shadows danced eerily between the trees, and the wind seemed to hum with a strange energy. It was then that the animals began to act differently. The usual patterns of movement were disrupted. Squirrels scurried nervously through the branches, their eyes wide with fear. Owls perched silently in the shadows, their heads turning unnaturally to follow the slightest movement below. In the heart of the sanctuary, where the butterfly bush had taken root the deepest, a peculiar event occurred. A herd of wolves appeared, not the usual solitary predators of the forest, but a large pack, their fur matted and their eyes wild. They moved through the underbrush with eerie synchronization, their heads held high, sniffing the air. The scent of the butterfly bush seemed to call to them, beckoning them closer, though the wolves did not know why. They stopped at the edge of the thicket, their bodies tensing as they observed the lush, almost unnatural growth that had consumed the forest floor. The flowers, vibrant and alive with color, seemed to pulse in the moonlight, their sweet fragrance filling the air like a soft, intoxicating lullaby. Suddenly, the wolves moved in unison, darting into the brush, their claws scraping the earth as they pushed through the dense foliage. It was then that the tension in the air reached its peak, an electric hum that sent chills down the spines of every creature in the forest. A figure emerged from the shadows, silhouetted by the moon. It was a lone wolf, smaller than the rest, its coat a strange mix of black and silver. Its eyes, however, were not like the others. They gleamed with intelligence, sharp and calculating, as if the wolf were more than just an animal. This one had seen the change, felt the shift, and it was the one that now led the pack deeper into the thicket, its paws stepping carefully, as if it knew the forest was watching. But as the pack ventured further, the ground began to shift beneath them. The vines of the butterfly bush writhed like living creatures, their tendrils wrapping around the wolves' legs, pulling them into the earth. The pack howled in unison, their voices rising into the night. But it was not just fear that echoed in the air. It was something more ancient. The moonlight flickered as the wolves struggled against the creeping vines, their movements becoming frantic. The lone wolf leader turned its eyes, locking onto the dark heart of the bush, and then, in a flash, leaping over the writhing vines, and with one swift motion, it reached the center of the bush. There, something impossibly strange happened. The bushes parted, the flowers opening up as though welcoming the wolf. The air thickened, the scent of the blossoms turning heavier, more intoxicating. The leader stood motionless, its eyes wide as it gazed into the heart of the bush. Suddenly, the forest fell completely silent. The pack of wolves, now free from the vines, looked toward their leader. But something was different. The wolf that had led them had changed. Its coat shimmered in the moonlight, and its eyes glowed with a strange, unnatural light. It was no longer the leader they had followed. It was something more. And then the wolf turned. With a swift motion, the pack followed. They moved as one, not just as wolves, but as something else, something greater. The pack was no longer just a group of animals. They were a force, united by the power of the butterfly bush, a force that would forever change the sanctuary. In the days that followed, the forest was transformed. The flowers of the butterfly bush continued to spread, more vibrant than ever, and the animals of the sanctuary began to move differently. No longer did they roam freely through the woods. They had become part of the revolution, part of something much bigger than themselves. The sanctuary had been forever changed, and the forest had become a place where the power of nature, once dormant, had awakened. But in the silence that followed, there was only one question left to ask. What had the wolves awakened within the heart of the butterfly bush? Days passed and the forest seemed to grow more alive with each dawn. The air buzzed with a strange energy that pulsed beneath the surface. The trees, though still towering and ancient, seemed to lean in closer to the butterfly bush, as though they too were drawn to the growing force in the center of the sanctuary. Every plant, every creature, reacted as if they too were participants in something far beyond their understanding. The once familiar sounds of the forest now carried an undercurrent of unease. The breeze whispered more urgently through the branches, and the calls of the birds became erratic, as if they were trying to warn the animals of an impending change. Yet, no one could quite understand what was happening. The animals of the sanctuary, once peaceful and unaware of the broader workings of the world, now moved with purpose, a strange sense of awareness in their eyes. The wolves had become different. The leader, whose coat now shimmered with an ethereal glow, had assumed a new form, one more powerful, more connected to the forest than ever before. The pack, once wild creatures of the forest, now walked with a regal bearing. Their movements were precise, their eyes sharp and knowing. They no longer acted solely out of instinct. They were driven by something else. The butterfly bush, once merely a cluster of delicate flowers, had become a force to be reckoned with. Its vines stretched farther than before, winding around the roots of trees, around the trunks, and across the very ground they walked on. The bush, in all its vivid purple splendor, pulsed with life almost as if it had its own heartbeat. Its presence now felt like an oppressive force, pressing against the souls of every living creature in the sanctuary. In the heart of the forest, the once quiet clearing was now a hub of movement. The bushes were no longer just spreading. They were actively consuming the land, wrapping themselves around stones, creeping into hidden caves, and even climbing up the mighty oak trees. Their presence was suffocating, as if the very air had thickened with their energy. The wildlife, unsure of what to make of this transformation, began to gather near the clearing, almost as though they were waiting for something. And then the twist came. One morning, as the first rays of the sun pierced through the thick canopy above, something unsettling happened. The butterfly bush, whose fragrance had once been sweet and calming, began to release a sharp, acrid stench so overwhelming that it drove the animals to panic. The flowers, still vibrant and glowing with their strange luminescence, seemed to twist and curl in on themselves, as if recoiling from something unknown. The once beautiful bush began to darken, its colors shifting from brilliant purples and blues to deep, inky blacks, the petals wilting as if drained of life. The wolves who had stood at the center of the bush's growing power began to howl, not in the fierce, triumphant tones of their past, but in terror. Their once glowing eyes dulled as they staggered away from the heart of the bush, confusion and fear evident in their movements. The leader, who had once seemed so powerful, now stumbled back, its once proud form weakening, its fur no longer shimmering but falling into patches, as if the life within it was draining away. And the other animals, drawn to the forest's heart, now turned and fled, their instincts screaming that something was wrong. The air was thick with an energy that was no longer nurturing, it was destructive, pulling the very essence of life from the earth. As the last of the wolves fled the clearing, a figure emerged from the depths of the forest, a figure no one had seen for decades. It was the protector of the sanctuary, a solitary figure who had kept watch over the land for as long as anyone could remember. Cloaked in shadows, its form barely visible through the fog, it moved forward, a deep understanding in its eyes. The protector approached the butterfly bush, now withered and dying, and placed a single hand on the remaining petals. The energy in the air shifted, a sudden tension releasing as the forest seemed to hold its breath. A low, rumbling sound echoed through the earth, like the groan of the forest itself awakening. The bush, though still lifeless and withered, began to shake, its roots pulling from the soil with an audible crack. The protector closed their eyes and whispered softly, though no words could be heard. The vines, once so tightly wound around the land, began to retract, slowly at first, as if the very earth itself was in pain. The once proud bush, now a hollow shell, trembled violently as its roots tore from the soil. And then, in a final, terrible twist, the bush disintegrated into a cloud of dust, its final exhale filling the air with an acrid scent. The forest seemed to shudder in relief, the unnatural weight lifting from the sanctuary as life began to creep back in. The animals, still skittish but cautiously returning, watched from the edges of the clearing. The wolves, now fully returned to their natural state, gathered in the shadows, their leader now standing apart, weary but alive. The protector turned away, their cloaks swirling around them, and began to retreat into the forest from which they came. They had done what was necessary. The balance had been restored. Yet, the forest had changed. It would never be the same again. There was an unspoken understanding now among the animals, knowing, a shared history of something powerful that had nearly overtaken them all. But for now, the silence returned, heavy and thoughtful, as the creatures of the sanctuary moved once again through their home, their sanctuary. But deep within the heart of the forest, beneath the soil where the butterfly bush had once thrived, something stirred, a root, a seed, a promise. Nature had a way of never truly forgetting. And as the sun set that evening, casting its fading light over the now quiet sanctuary, the forest waited. The days turned into weeks, and life in the sanctuary slowly returned to its natural rhythm. The forest, once charged with an unsettling energy, was now filled with a quiet peace. The animals, though shaken by the events they had witnessed, began to go about their routines. The trees swayed in the breeze, the rivers babbled as they always had, and the calls of birds filled the air in a symphony of life. But even in this newfound tranquility, the air still felt heavy, as if something unseen lingered just beyond the reach of their senses. The forest had been marked by the encounter with the butterfly bush, its effects, subtle yet undeniable. Every now and then, a ripple would pass through the canopy, as if the trees themselves remembered the unnatural power that had once lived among them. And then, as the autumn leaves began to turn shades of amber and gold, something strange began to happen. At first it was small and noticeable to all but the most observant. The bushes, the plants, and the flowers in the sanctuary began to change. They grew faster, their leaves more vibrant, their flowers blooming out of season, their colors more intense. The wildlife, once so attuned to the natural cycles of the land, began to behave oddly. Deer wandered closer to the edges of the forest, as if searching for something that wasn't there. Rabbits, usually skittish and elusive, now ventured into the clearing where the butterfly bush had once stood, as if drawn by an invisible force. Even the birds, who had been cautious, seemed to be circling the area more often, their wings slicing through the air with a sense of urgency. The leader of the wolves, whose coat had finally returned to its natural state, began to sense it first. There was something beneath the soil, something pulsing, something that shouldn't be there. His pack, ever faithful, grew restless, their senses keen to the changes around them. The animals that had been so eager to reclaim their peace now stood on edge, watching, waiting for something to shift once again. And then it came. One cold evening, as dusk descended upon the forest and the last light of the sun slipped behind the horizon, the air grew thick with an unnatural stillness. The animals stopped their movements, the trees held their breath, and even the wind seemed to pause. In the clearing, the once quiet ground trembled faintly, as if the forest itself was stirring in its sleep. From beneath the earth, roots began to stir. It was subtle at first, slight tremor in the ground, a faint crackling of dry leaves. But soon, the ground began to buckle, as if something immense was pushing its way up from deep within the soil. The earth shifted and groaned, sending vibrations through the trunks of the trees, making them shiver with unease. The wolves watched in silence, their instincts screaming that something was about to change. And then the first shoots broke through the surface. At first, they were small, just a few thin tendrils poking through the earth. But then they began to grow, twisting upward with an unnatural speed, as though the forest was rushing to meet them. The shoots sprouted leaves long, twisting vines that shimmered in the moonlight, glowing faintly with an eerie luminescence. They seemed familiar, yet wrong. There was no doubt in the wolves' eyes now. This was no ordinary plant. This was the butterfly bush, but it was not the same as before. The bush had returned, not as a vibrant, colorful plant, but as something darker, more dangerous. The flowers that bloomed were jagged, their petals sharp and curled, radiating a faint but disturbing pulse. The vines snaked out farther than ever before, reaching towards the trees, the rocks, the very air. The animals, once again sensing the power that had come with it, began to retreat. The wolves, now wise to the growing threat, stood their ground for a moment longer before turning and disappearing into the shadows, their instincts guiding them away from the clearing. The deer fled, the rabbits scattered, and the birds took flight, rising into the night sky. But there was something different this time. The protector, who had vanished as mysteriously as they had appeared before, had sensed the return of the bush as well. They emerged once again from the depths of the forest, their movements swift and determined. But this time, they were not alone. The creatures of the forest, those who had once been mere spectators to the power of the butterfly bush, had gathered. There were those who had fought against the bush before, those who had witnessed its consuming power and had barely escaped with their lives. Now, they stood together, united in their understanding that the forest needed them. The protector stepped forward, their eyes glinting with an ancient wisdom as they surveyed the new threat. The forest had not been prepared for this. The butterfly bush was different now. Its power was darker, more insidious. But they had faced it before, and they would face it again. The leader of the wolves, still shaken but resolute, stepped forward, his pack at his side. They would not let the sanctuary fall again. The creatures who had gathered stood in silence, waiting for the signal, each one feeling the weight of the moment. Together, they would fight. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, a final, terrifying roar filled the air, a sound that shook the very earth beneath them. The butterfly bush's roots tore through the soil, its vines extending to the skies, consuming everything in its path. But this time, the forest was ready. The protector, along with the animals who had rallied, moved forward. The tension reached its peak as the battle between the natural world and the corrupting force of the bush began. The ground trembled, the trees groaned, and the very air crackled with power as the forest fought to reclaim what was its own. In the end, the question remained: would the forest overcome the darkness that had invaded it? Or was this the beginning of a new, uncontrollable force that would change the sanctuary forever? And as the first rays of sunlight broke through the canopy, the battle for the soul of the forest began.